My 6-year-old son broke into my room screaming, "What did you do to the raccoon in my room?" We called animal control on him, sweetie, but he gave me the best friend mark. My son rolled up his pajama leg to show me the 2 puncture wounds on his calf. I saw dried blood around the edges and a bite mark that looked maybe a day or 2 old. My 6-year-old had been bitten by the same raccoon we'd found in his closet that morning, the one that had been acting strange and aggressive. When did this happen? I tried to keep my voice calm. Tuesday night. He was scared, so I shared my goldfish crackers. Tyler wiped his nose on his sleeve. Tuesday. 3 days ago. 3 days of potential rabies exposure. 3 days of the virus potentially spreading through his little body. I grabbed my keys and purse in one motion while calling his dad to meet us at the emergency room. The drive was the longest 15 minutes of my life. Tyler chatted about his raccoon friend not understanding why I was driving so fast, how the raccoon had seemed sick, how it had been drooling and walking funny. Every symptom of rabies he described made my hands grip the steering wheel tighter. At the ER, I carried him straight to the desk. The triage nurse took one look at the bite and heard the word raccoon before rushing us back. No waiting, no paperwork first. Straight to an isolation room where doctors appeared within seconds. They examined the wound while firing questions at both of us. When was the bite? Had we kept the raccoon? What were its symptoms? Tyler answered innocently about sharing his bed with his friend for several nights. How the raccoon had been living in his closet. How they'd played together. We need to start post-exposure prophylaxis immediately. The doctor was already preparing injections. I held Tyler as they cleaned the wound. He screamed when they injected immunoglobulin directly into the bite site. Then more shots in his arms and thighs. His dad arrived as they were finishing, and I had to explain how I'd missed a wild animal living in our 6-year-old's room. "Did you share any food with your friends at school?" the doctor asked Tyler. "No, but we all drank from the same water fountain." The doctor's face changed. He stepped into the hallway to make calls. I could hear him saying things like potential exposure and contact tracing, an urgent public health matter. My stomach dropped, realizing this was bigger than just Tyler. A woman from the health department arrived within an hour. She needed the names of every child Tyler had close contact with, his teacher, kids on the bus, everyone who might have shared that water fountain. The list kept growing as Tyler remembered more friends. They moved us to a special observation room. Tyler had to stay for monitoring while they started calling parents. I could hear conversations in the hallway, panicked families being told to come in for preventative treatment, the entire kindergarten class potentially exposed. Tyler's teacher arrived with her own bite marks. Apparently, the raccoon had been visiting multiple houses in our neighborhood. 3 other children from his class had been playing with it, feeding it, letting it sleep in their beds. None of the parents had known. Animal control finally called with test results. The raccoon was positive for rabies. Confirmed case. Every person who'd had contact needed immediate treatment. The virus was fatal once symptoms appeared, and they could appear any day. The health department woman returned with more questions. Had we traveled recently? Had Tyler been anywhere else he might have spread exposure? Then she asked, "Has your son been to any birthday parties recently?" Tyler had been to 3 parties in the last week. Swimming parties where kids shared drinks, sleepover parties where they'd all piled into beds together, pizza parties where they'd eaten off each other's plates, normal kid stuff that now meant potential rabies exposure to families across town. She left to make more calls. The health department woman came back one last time. Tyler mentioned the raccoon had babies. "Do you know where they might be?" I felt the room spin. Tyler had said something about baby raccoons in the attic. I'd thought it was just his imagination, but if the mother had been rabid and nursing, "We need to evacuate your entire neighborhood. Tonight." All of a sudden, our entire town was literally on the brink of getting wiped out by a single raccoon. Requested Reads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. The health department woman came back into the room carrying a rolled-up paper. She spread it across the small table, and I saw our address circled in red marker at the center. 3 rings expanded outward from our house in different colors. She pointed to the innermost yellow ring covering our block. Those families needed immediate evacuation and screening. The orange ring 2 blocks out meant elevated risk and contact tracing. The outer red ring stretched across half our neighborhood and meant potential exposure monitoring. She explained that baby raccoons nursing from an infected mother would almost certainly carry the virus. They needed to find every single one before they scattered into backyards and storm drains across town. A man in a dark green uniform appeared in the doorway, with 2 other people wearing the same outfit. He introduced himself as Trent Hardy from Animal Control. His team would extract everything from our attic tonight under emergency protocols. He needed our house keys right away. I fumbled in my purse and handed them over while he asked questions I could barely process. Where was the attic access? What kind of insulation did we have? How long had we heard scratching sounds up there? I admitted we'd heard noises for maybe 2 months, but thought it was just the house settling. Normal creaks and bumps that old houses make. Trent wrote everything down without judgment, but I felt stupid anyway. The door opened again, and Natalia rushed in. Her face went white when she saw Tyler hooked up to the monitoring equipment, the bandages on his injection sites, the fourth line in his small arm. She looked at me, and I watched her whole expression crumble. We stepped into the hallway, and a nurse stayed with Tyler. Natalia grabbed me, and I grabbed her back. She was shaking, and I realized I was too. For the first time since finding that raccoon in Tyler's closet this morning, I let myself cry. I didn't have to be the only strong one anymore. We stood there holding each other while people walked past us in the busy hospital corridor. Another man in a suit approached us after a few minutes. He said his name was Edgar McPherson, and he was coordinating the health department response. Our entire block needed to clear out by 8 tonight. Animal control needed safe access for the overnight operation. He was setting up emergency shelter at the elementary school gym. We could only take essential items because our house was technically a biohazard site until cleared. I checked my phone and saw it was already 5:30. We had 2.5 hours to pack up and get out. A doctor came to discharge us with a thick stack of papers. She said her name was Dr. Torres. We needed to bring Tyler back immediately if he showed any symptoms: fever or headache, nausea or behavior changes. She handed me a folder stuffed with information about rabies progression and vaccine schedules and warning signs. She told me that knowledge was better than fear right now. I wasn't sure I believed her, but I took the folder anyway. Natalia called her parents and arranged to bring Tyler there. They lived across town, far from the evacuation zone. I would go home and pack bags for all of us. We got Tyler dressed and into the car. Natalia drove toward her parents' house while I took our other car toward home. The whole drive, I kept thinking about infected animals living above our heads, walking around in our attic while we slept below them. I pulled into our driveway and ran inside. The house looked normal but felt different now, dangerous somehow. I grabbed duffel bags from the hall closet and started throwing things in. Clothes from our bedroom, toothbrushes and soap from the bathroom, Tyler's stuffed elephant from his bed because he couldn't sleep without it. I was in the hallway when the front door opened. Jaden walked in from his friend's house and stopped when he saw me with bags everywhere. I had to explain everything fast. The raccoon that bit Tyler, the babies in the attic, the evacuation happening in 2 hours. I watched his face change from confused to scared to angry. He asked why I didn't notice something was wrong sooner. The question hit me hard because I'd been asking myself the same thing. Jaden stood there looking at the floor. Then he said he heard scratching in the attic weeks ago. He didn't tell anyone because he thought it was cool that we might have animals living up there. The guilt on his face looked exactly like what I'd been feeling all day. I dropped the bag I was holding and pulled him into a hug. I told him this wasn't his fault. None of us knew what we were dealing with. We finished packing together and carried the bags outside. Other families were coming out of their houses now. People dragging suitcases with confused kids trailing behind them. Animal control trucks lined our street. Health department vans were parked at intervals. A man I recognized from 3 doors down walked straight toward me across his lawn. Alvin Hood. He wanted to know why my family's problem was forcing his whole family out of their home. I tried to explain that we didn't know about the raccoon, that we were victims too. But Alvin cut me off and said that's what negligent parents always say. Trent Hardy walked over from his truck. He stepped between us and told Alvin firmly that the construction company who built these houses left gaps in the soffits. Those gaps allowed wildlife access to multiple attics. This could have happened to anyone on the block. Trent showed us photos on his tablet of the roof defects. Alvin looked at the pictures, and his anger seemed to deflate a little. He walked back to his house without saying anything else. We loaded the bags into both cars, and I followed Natalia toward the elementary school. The drive took 20 minutes through streets that looked wrong somehow with so many people leaving their houses at once. Cars backed out of driveways up and down every block. Kids pressed their faces against windows holding stuffed animals and blankets. At the school parking lot, volunteers in red vests directed us where to the park. I grabbed our bags from the trunk and Tyler's hand. The gym doors stood propped open with people streaming inside. We walked through the entrance, and I stopped to take in the scene. Rows and rows of cots filled the basketball court. Red Cross volunteers moved between families handing out blankets and pillows. A table near the entrance had stacks of water bottles and snack boxes. Tyler pulled on my hand and pointed at the cots. He said this looked like camping and asked if we could pick spots near the basketball hoop. I squeezed his hand and told him we could try. Natalia was already walking toward the registration table where 2 volunteers sat with clipboards and laptops. We got in line behind 3 other families. Tyler bounced on his toes looking around at all the other kids. He waved at a boy from his class who was helping his mom carry blankets. The line moved forward, and we reached the table. A volunteer with gray hair and kind eyes smiled at us. She asked for our names and address. Natalia gave her the information while I kept hold of Tyler, who was trying to wander off toward the snacks. The volunteer typed everything into her laptop and then handed us a thick folder. She said it had information about emergency housing help and financial aid. Then she mentioned that the health department was setting up a big clinic here tomorrow morning. Anyone who might have been around the raccoon needed to come get checked out and maybe get shots. She said we should plan to spend most of the day here tomorrow. Natalia thanked her, and we moved away from the table to find cots. Tyler ran ahead, weaving between families. I followed him, carrying our bags. He found 3 cots together near the far wall and claimed them by throwing his stuffed elephant on the middle one. Jaden dropped his backpack on one end and pulled out his phone. Natalia and I put our bags down. I looked around at all the displaced families and wondered how many of them blamed us for being here. The gym filled with more people as the evening went on. Volunteers brought in pizza boxes and set up a serving area. Tyler ate 2 slices and then wanted to play basketball with the other kids, but the volunteers said no running or playing because of all the cots. He came back to our spot looking disappointed. As it got later, the overhead lights stayed bright. No one turned them off. Tyler lay down on his cot and pulled his blanket up. I could see him fidgeting and rolling over. The sounds were all wrong for sleeping. People talking in low voices, babies crying, someone's phone alarm going off. The emergency exit sign buzzed. Tyler sat up and said he couldn't sleep. I moved to his cot and lay down next to him. The cot was too small for both of us, but I squeezed in anyway. I held his hand and started singing the songs I used to sing when he was little. The Wheels on the Bus, Twinkle, Twinkle. His breathing got slower, but he didn't fall asleep. Natalia sat on her cot with her phone trying to find information about how long we'd be stuck here. She scrolled through news sites and neighborhood social media groups. Around midnight, I saw a man in a suit walking through the gym, stopping at different families. He had a clipboard and talked quietly with parents who looked worried after he left. When he got to us, he introduced himself as Edgar McPherson from the health department. He asked if we could talk privately. We got up and followed him to a corner away from the cots. Edgar said he needed to tell us something as part of standard rules. When a child gets hurt because of something dangerous in their home, CPS has to be told about it. Someone would need to come talk to us about how we keep our house safe and how the raccoon situation happened without anyone knowing. He said it was just normal steps they had to take. My chest got tight listening to him. Natalia asked when someone would come. Edgar said probably in the next few days. He told us to be honest and cooperative and everything would be okay. Then he moved on to talk to another family. I looked at Natalia and saw my own fear on her face. We went back to our cots without talking. I lay down but didn't sleep. Morning came with volunteers moving through the gym, turning on even more lights and setting up tables. Health department workers arrived with boxes of supplies. They arranged the tables into stations with signs. Registration, examination, pharmacy. The gym turned into a medical clinic right in front of us. Families started lining up at the registration table. Tyler woke up cranky from bad sleep. I gave him a granola bar from the snack table. A man walked through the gym entrance and I recognized him. Royce Adair, Tyler's kindergarten teacher. He looked terrible. His eyes had dark circles under them, and he moved slowly. He saw me and walked over. He held up his arms to show me white bandages wrapped around both forearms. He said the raccoon bit him 2 days ago. He found it in the shed where they keep the outdoor play stuff. He thought it was just protecting its space, so he only told the janitor to set traps. Now he was here getting the shots. His voice shook when he talked. He said he was so scared that he gave rabies to the whole kindergarten class the next day during story time. I told him that's not how it works. The health officials keep saying you can't spread it like that. But Royce kept saying, what if he was wrong? What if he touched something and then a kid touched it? What if his saliva got on a book? I didn't know what to tell him. He looked like he might cry. A health department worker called his name, and he walked toward the examination area. More families kept arriving. The gym got crowded and loud. Then Edgar McPherson stood on a chair near the center and called for everyone's attention. People stopped talking and turned toward him. He explained that they needed detailed information from everyone. Every person you touched in the last 2 weeks. Every meal you shared. Every water fountain you used. The room exploded with voices. Parents shouted questions about privacy, about who would see this information, about whether they could get sued, about how far this might spread. Edgar raised his hands and tried to answer, but more questions kept coming. I felt Natalia's hand on my back. She pushed me forward a little. I knew what she wanted me to do. I stood up and my legs felt shaky. I raised my hand and Edgar pointed at me. I said I wanted to share our story. The room got quiet. I talked about Tyler's bites, about the 3 birthday parties he went to, about the school water fountain, about how we didn't know. I said Edgar told us that being honest would help people understand why this was so serious. Some parents looked at us with soft faces, but others whispered to each other and pulled their kids away from us like we were sick, even though that's not how any of this works. After I sat down, a woman walked toward us. She had a little girl with her. I recognized them from one of Tyler's birthday parties. The woman said her name was Jasmine Lee. Instead of being mad, she thanked me for talking. She said her daughter had been complaining about a scratch on her ankle for days. Jasmine thought it was from the playground, but now she was wondering if it could be something else. We walked together toward the examination area. A health worker had Jasmine's daughter sit on a chair. The worker looked at her ankle carefully. She called over another worker. They both looked at the mostly healed marks. One of them said it could be teeth marks, from a small animal, from about a week ago. Jasmine started shaking. Her whole body trembled. The workers said they needed to start the shots right away. They went to get supplies. I sat down next to Jasmine and took her hand. She looked at me with wet eyes. I told her I knew exactly how she felt right now. I stayed with her while they cleaned her daughter's ankle and gave her the first painful shots. The little girl screamed just like Tyler did. Jasmine held her and cried. I kept holding Jasmine's other hand because someone held mine when Tyler got his shots and it helped. My phone buzzed in my pocket and I saw my boss's name on the screen. I stepped away from the crowd toward a quieter corner near the gym's equipment closet. He started talking before I could even say hello, asking when I was coming back to work because they were short-staffed and he needed me on the schedule. I explained that my son got exposed to rabies and we got evacuated from our house and were staying in an emergency shelter. He said that wasn't his problem and I needed to figure out coverage or face disciplinary action. I tried to explain about the medical appointments and the health department requirements, but he cut me off saying he couldn't approve more than 3 days of emergency leave without proper documentation. Natalia appeared next to me and held out her hand for the phone. Her face had that expression I recognized from when she dealt with difficult insurance companies at work. She took the phone from me, and her voice changed completely, becoming cold and professional in a way I'd never heard before. She explained medical emergency protocols and mentioned something about her hospital's legal department contacting my employer about discrimination against employees with family health crises. My boss's tone shifted immediately through the phone speaker. He backed down and said to take whatever time I needed and just send documentation when things settled. Natalia handed the phone back to me and walked away without saying anything. I felt grateful that she handled it, but also embarrassed that I couldn't manage my own boss myself. Trent Hardy walked into the gym carrying a clipboard and wearing protective gear that looked like he'd just come from a hazmat site. He spotted me and came over with his team following behind. He said they removed 5 baby raccoons from our attic about an hour ago. All of them were approximately 6 weeks old, and all of them showed neurological symptoms consistent with rabies. The bodies were being tested at the state lab, but he was treating this as confirmed positive until proven otherwise. He explained that our house needed extensive decontamination before we could return home. The attic insulation had to be completely replaced because of contamination from droppings and urine. Every surface the animals touched needed professional cleaning. The soffit gaps where the mother entered needed repairs to prevent future wildlife access. He handed me a preliminary estimate sheet. I looked at the numbers and felt my chest tighten. $8,000 for biohazard remediation, attic insulation replacement, and soffit repairs. Our insurance would cover $3,000 after the deductible. That left $5,000 we had to pay ourselves. Natalia came over and looked at the estimate over my shoulder. We sat down on folding chairs near the wall and stared at the numbers together. Medical bills were already starting to arrive in my email from Tyler's ER visit and shots. The immunoglobulin injection alone cost over $2,000 before insurance. We had to figure out how to pay for all of this while I was taking unpaid leave from work and Natalia was missing shifts. A commotion started near the gym entrance, and I looked up to see a news crew with cameras and microphones trying to get inside. Edgar rushed over and intercepted them before they could get past the door. He guided them back outside, and I watched through the gym windows as he held an impromptu press conference on the front steps. He stood in front of the cameras and explained the public health response without naming any families. He talked about wildlife rabies, the importance of post-exposure treatment, and community cooperation. His body language was calm and professional, but I knew it was only a matter of time before reporters started asking around the neighborhood and figured out which family owned the house with the infected raccoons. Our names would get out eventually, and then everyone would know we were the ones who caused all this. A woman in business casual clothes entered the gym and spoke briefly with Edgar before he pointed in our direction. She walked over and introduced herself as Elena Novikov from Child Protective Services. She asked if Natalia and I could speak with her privately. The school principal had made a corner office available for interviews. My stomach twisted as we followed her down the hallway. She closed the door behind us and sat across from us at a small table. Her voice was professional, but firm when she explained that she needed to understand how Tyler had unsupervised access to a wild animal for multiple days without adult intervention or awareness. This was standard protocol when children suffered preventable injuries due to household hazards. She needed to assess our home safety practices and parenting oversight. I walked her through our typical routines, trying to keep my voice steady. Both Natalia and I worked full-time jobs. Jaden sometimes watched Tyler for an hour after school, until one of us got home. Tyler played independently in his room most evenings while we made dinner and handled household tasks. It was normal family chaos, where you couldn't monitor every single moment of every single day. Elena took notes without any visible judgment on her face. She asked questions about our home safety practices, like whether we had working smoke detectors and whether we kept cleaning supplies locked away. She asked whether we'd noticed any behavioral changes in Tyler that might have indicated something was wrong. Had he been more secretive than usual? Had his sleep patterns changed? Had we seen any scratches or marks on him before we found the raccoon? I admitted that I'd noticed Tyler spending more time in his room with the door closed, but I'd thought he was just playing with his toys. Natalia said Tyler had been asking for extra snacks to take upstairs, but we'd assumed he was having growth spurts. Elena kept writing everything down. That evening, Tyler felt warm when I touched his forehead. I found a thermometer and checked his temperature. It read 100.2 degrees. Dr. Torres had warned us this could be a normal reaction to the immunoglobulin injection, but my brain immediately jumped to rabies symptoms. Natalia saw the thermometer reading, and her face went pale. We both knew logically that it was too soon for rabies to show symptoms, but logic didn't matter when your child had a fever after rabies exposure. We grabbed Tyler and drove to the emergency room in a panic. The attending physician examined him thoroughly and ran blood work. He checked Tyler's reflexes and looked in his throat and listened to his breathing. After what felt like hours, he came back and reassured us that everything looked consistent with vaccine response rather than rabies progression. Tyler's white blood cell count was slightly elevated, which was normal after immunoglobulin injection. His fever was mild, and his other vital signs were stable. We should monitor him closely overnight, but there was no indication of rabies infection. We drove back to the gym, feeling embarrassed about our panic, but unable to shake the fear completely. Back at the gym, several other families were dealing with their own medical scares. A mother held her son who complained about a headache. Another child was crying about feeling sick to her stomach. Parents were convincing themselves that every normal childhood symptom was the beginning of rabies. The health department staff moved from family to family, patiently evaluating each case. They explained over and over that the incubation period for rabies was longer than a few days. They explained that post-exposure prophylaxis was highly effective when started promptly, like all our children had received. They showed charts and data about vaccine success rates. Most of the symptoms people were reporting were either normal childhood illnesses or anxiety responses to the stressful situation. But every parent needed that reassurance from medical professionals before they could breathe normally again. Trent Hardy returned later with his team carrying a tablet computer. He asked if he could show me photos of what they found in our attic. I sat down, and he pulled up image after image of nesting materials made from torn insulation and cardboard. Droppings scattered across the attic floor, urine stains on the wooden beams, evidence that the mother raccoon had been living there for at least 2 months, based on the accumulation. He swiped to photos of the entry point where our soffit met the roofline, a gap barely 3 inches wide that we never would have noticed from the ground. He zoomed in to show how the construction company used substandard materials that deteriorated faster than they should have. The wood was rotted, and the metal flashing was rusted through. He said at least 4 other houses on our block had similar gaps, and they were inspecting all of them now. This wasn't just our family's mistake. This was a construction defect that affected the whole neighborhood. Trent came back the next morning with his tablet showing more photos, and his face told me the news was bad before he even opened his mouth. He swiped through images of water damage spreading across the ceiling in Jaden's room, where raccoon urine had soaked through the insulation and stained the drywall in dark spreading patches. He zoomed in on sections where the contamination had spread further than they initially thought. The cleanup area needed to expand by another 100 square feet, and they'd have to remove and replace the damaged ceiling sections completely. The new estimate came to $12,000. I felt my chest tighten as he walked me through the breakdown of costs. Natalia stood next to me reading the numbers over my shoulder, and I heard her breath catch when she saw the total. Our insurance would cover $3,000 after the deductible, which left us with $9,000 to pay out of pocket. We'd been saving for years to build up our emergency fund, and now we'd have to drain almost all of it, or take out a loan we couldn't really afford. Natalia pulled me aside, and we did the math on her phone calculator. Between the medical bills that were already starting to arrive and this remediation cost, we were looking at close to $15,000 in unexpected expenses. Our monthly budget had no room for loan payments, and cutting back on other things would only stretch so far. That night, after the kids finally fell asleep on their cots, Natalia grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the exit. We walked out to our car in the parking lot, and she climbed into the passenger seat while I got behind the wheel. She turned to face me, and I could see anger in her eyes that had been building all day. She said I was home more than her over the past few months, and how did I not hear scratching sounds in the attic, or notice that Tyler was acting strange? I felt my defenses go up immediately and pointed out that she was the one who kept dismissing my concerns when I mentioned Tyler spending too much time alone in his room. She said I should have pushed harder, and I said she should have listened better. Our voices got louder, even though we were trying to keep quiet so the kids inside wouldn't hear. She accused me of not taking my parenting responsibilities seriously enough, and I accused her of always being at work instead of home with the family. We went back and forth, throwing blame at each other for things that had nothing to do with the raccoon, because we needed somewhere to put all this fear and anger and guilt. Then Natalia started crying, and I felt all my anger drain away. I reached for her hand, and she grabbed onto me like I was the only solid thing in a world that was falling apart. We both broke down, admitting that we were looking for someone to blame, because the other option was accepting that sometimes terrible things happen, no matter how careful you try to be. She said between sobs that she was scared CPS would decide we were bad parents and take the kids away. I told her I was scared Tyler would never feel safe at home again, even after everything got cleaned and fixed. We sat there in the dark car, holding each other and crying until we didn't have any tears left. Neither of us had answers, but at least we weren't fighting anymore. The next morning, Edgar found us in the gym while we were trying to get the kids to eat breakfast from the donated food table. He pulled us aside with an urgent look on his face and said they just got a call from a parent reporting that their child went to a birthday party with Tyler 10 days ago. The party was at a trampoline park, and there were about 30 kids there from different schools all jumping and playing together. Edgar needed the venue name and the exact date and time so they could try to track down every family who might have been there. I felt sick, thinking about 30 more kids potentially exposed because of Tyler. Natalia was already pulling out her phone to search through her calendar and email for the invitation. I found the invitation in my deleted emails and forwarded it to Edgar while my hands shook. The party was at Jump Zone on a Saturday afternoon, and Tyler had been there for 2 hours. Edgar made calls right there in front of us, speaking quickly to someone at the health department about expanding the contact tracing radius. I called the trampoline park and asked to speak to the manager. The woman who answered was helpful when I explained the situation, but she said they only kept records for the private party room where the birthday kid and his close friends were. The public jump area where all the other kids played didn't have any attendance tracking. That meant some families might never know their children were there that day. They might never know their kids were at risk. Edgar took down all the information and said his team would do everything possible to identify and contact families, but there would be gaps in their ability to reach everyone. Edgar called later that afternoon to tell us about a town hall meeting scheduled for that evening at the community center. He wanted affected families to come so the health department could give accurate information and stop the rumors that were spreading all over neighborhood social media. Natalia and I sat on our cots talking about whether we should go. She worried about facing angry neighbors who would blame us for everything. I worried about the same thing, but also thought that hiding would make us look guilty and make things worse. We went back and forth for an hour before deciding that we needed to show up and face whatever came. Tyler and Jaden would stay at the gym with Natalia's parents, who drove over to watch them. The community center parking lot was packed when we arrived, and we had to the park 3 blocks away. Walking toward the building, I could see people streaming in through the main doors, and the crowd looked bigger than any event I'd ever seen there. Inside the main hall, every chair was filled, and people lined the walls, standing shoulder to shoulder. I counted at least 200 people, and the room buzzed with scared and angry conversations. Edgar stood at the front with his health department team, setting up a projector and laptop. We found spots along the back wall, trying to make ourselves small and invisible. Edgar started the presentation by showing a map of our neighborhood with our house marked at the center. Red circles spread outward, showing the exposure zones and potential contact points. He walked through a clear timeline of events, starting with when the raccoon likely entered our attic and ending with the current status of contact tracing. His team showed data about rabies in wildlife populations and construction standards that failed to prevent animal access. He explained this was a public health emergency caused by many factors coming together, including wildlife population growth and bad luck that an infected animal picked our neighborhood. When Edgar opened the floor for questions, Alvin Hood stood up in the third row and turned to look directly at me. He said, "Responsible parents don't let their children play with wild animals," and asked what kind of people don't notice a raccoon living in their house for weeks. Before I could respond, Jasmine Lee stood up a few rows behind him. She said her daughter also made friends with the raccoon, and she also missed the warning signs. She pointed out that blaming individual families ignored the fact that the health department had been warning about increased rabies cases in wildlife for 2 years, but nobody paid attention because there was no real public education campaign. The room got quiet as people listened to her explain that this could have happened to any family, and that looking for someone to blame wouldn't protect anyone's children. Natalia squeezed my hand and then stood up. Her voice came out steady, even though I could see her hands shaking at her sides. She said she works in healthcare administration, and even she didn't know what to look for, because rabies seems like something from old history books, not something that happens in modern neighborhoods. She challenged everyone in the room to honestly say they would have recognized the danger if a raccoon showed up in their kid's closet acting friendly. She asked how many people had ever actually seen information about rabies symptoms in animals or knew what to do if their child got bitten. The angry energy in the room shifted to uncomfortable silence as people looked at each other, realizing they didn't have good answers. After the meeting ended, several parents came over to us privately. They apologized for their first reactions, and some of them shared their own stories. One family admitted they'd been feeding raccoons on purpose in their backyard because the kids thought it was fun. Another parent said their daughter got scratched by a stray cat last month, and they just put a Band-Aid on it without thinking about rabies. Someone else mentioned finding a bat in their garage and just shooing it out instead of reporting it. A quiet understanding formed among those of us standing there that we were all just trying to keep our kids safe in a world where danger could show up in forms we never expected. People exchanged phone numbers, and someone suggested starting a neighborhood group to share information about wildlife safety. The solidarity felt fragile but real, and I left that night feeling less alone than I had since this whole thing started. The next morning, Natalia spent 3 hours on the phone with our insurance company, working through their appeals process. She had copies of every email, every inspection report, every health department document spread across the gym floor around her cot. I listened to her voice shift from frustrated to professional to almost pleading as she explained why this wasn't normal home maintenance, but an emergency health situation. The insurance rep put her on hold 4 times, and each time I watched her grip the phone tighter. Finally, she got transferred to a supervisor who reviewed the case and approved partial coverage for the remediation work. Natalia negotiated back and forth about the exact amount until they agreed to cover $6,000 of the $12,000 total. She immediately called the remediation company and worked out a payment plan that spread our $6,000 portion over 12 months. $500 a month would hurt, but we could manage it if we cut back on eating out and canceled our streaming services. She hung up and just sat there staring at her phone for a minute before looking at me with this tired smile that said we'd cleared one major hurdle, even though plenty more waited ahead. Tyler's second vaccine appointment was scheduled for that afternoon at the temporary clinic they'd set up in the gym. This time he knew what was coming and started crying the moment he saw the nurse preparing the injection station. He grabbed my arm and begged me not to make him get more shots, saying his legs still hurt from the first ones. I had to physically hold him still in the chair while the nurse cleaned the injection site, and Tyler screamed that I was being mean and he hated me. The needle went in and he thrashed so hard I almost lost my grip. Afterward, I felt like the worst parent in the world, even though I knew these shots were literally saving his life. I took him to the convenience store down the street and let him pick out any ice cream he wanted, plus a new action figure from the toy aisle. He chose the biggest ice cream sandwich and a superhero toy that cost $20. I paid without hesitating, even though I felt guilty about bribing him to associate something good with these horrible, necessary medical visits. Tyler ate his ice cream and played with his new toy on the walk back to the gym and seemed to forgive me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was traumatizing him further. That night, Jaden woke up screaming about animals crawling through the walls. Natalia and I both rushed to his cot and found him sitting up with his blanket pulled around him and his eyes wide open, but not really seeing us. He kept saying he could hear scratching and squeaking and something was going to bite him while he slept. We calmed him down, and he finally recognized where he was, but refused to lie back down. He said he couldn't sleep in his room anymore, even though we were still at the gym, and his actual room was a mile away being cleaned. The next morning, he was angry about everything. He complained about the gym breakfast being gross, even though it was the same cereal we had at home. He snapped at Tyler for breathing too loud. He said he was missing school and falling behind, and all his friends knew that our family was the reason the whole neighborhood got evacuated. Then he turned on Tyler and said this was all because of his stupid raccoon friend, and how could Tyler be so dumb to play with a wild animal? Tyler's face crumpled and he started crying, and I had to step between them. Natalia took Jaden outside while I stayed with Tyler. I could hear her voice through the gym doors, talking firmly, but not yelling. When they came back 20 minutes later, Jaden looked calmer, but wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. That evening, after Tyler fell asleep, Natalia and I sat down with Jaden in a quiet corner of the gym. We explained that Tyler was a victim too, and that being angry at him wasn't fair, because a 6-year-old doesn't understand disease transmission or wild animal danger. Jaden listened with his arms crossed and his jaw set tight. Then suddenly he broke down crying and admitted he was scared that maybe he'd touched something contaminated or breathed in infected dust or somehow got exposed without knowing it. He said he kept thinking about dying from rabies and his body shutting down and us having to watch him suffer. We hadn't realized he'd been carrying this fear alone for days while acting angry to cover it up. Natalia held him while he cried, and I promised we'd get him checked out to make sure he was safe. The next morning, I called Edgar and explained Jaden's fears. Edgar said Jaden's exposure risk was minimal since he hadn't had direct contact with the raccoon, but he'd schedule a precautionary evaluation to give Jaden peace of mind. The appointment happened that afternoon, and a doctor examined Jaden thoroughly, asked detailed questions about his activities, and confirmed he showed no signs of exposure and didn't need the vaccine series. Just hearing a medical professional say he was safe made Jaden's whole body relax. Edgar also gave us a referral for a counselor who specialized in childhood trauma. He said both boys would benefit from talking to someone trained to help kids process scary experiences like this. We scheduled appointments for the following week, recognizing that the psychological impacts would last longer than the physical danger. 5 days after the evacuation, Trent Hardy called to say the remediation company had finished their work. He offered to meet us at the house for a final walkthrough to show us everything they'd done. Natalia and I drove over while her parents watched the boys at the gym. Walking up to our house felt strange after almost a week away. Trent met us at the door with his clipboard and led us straight to the attic access. The new insulation was bright pink and fluffy, filling every gap where the old contaminated material had been. They'd replaced sections of drywall in Jaden's room where raccoon urine had soaked through and sealed every soffit gap with heavy metal screening. Trent showed us the one-way exclusion devices they'd installed on other potential entry points, explaining that any animal inside could get out, but nothing new could get in. The whole house smelled like industrial cleaners and fresh paint, sterile and unfamiliar like a hotel room instead of our home. Trent handed me a certificate stating the property was safe for occupancy and walked us through maintenance checks we should do quarterly to prevent future wildlife access. The next day, Elena Novikov arrived for her home safety assessment. She walked through each room with a detailed checklist, asking questions about our daily routines and how we plan to improve our vigilance going forward. She examined the remediation work, took photos of the sealed entry points, and reviewed the maintenance schedule Trent had given us. In the kitchen, she asked about our work schedules and childcare arrangements and whether we'd considered any changes to prevent similar oversights. Natalia explained we'd already arranged for Jaden to text us photos of Tyler's room every day after school as an extra check. Elena nodded and made notes on her tablet. After 2 hours, she sat down with us at the kitchen table and said she was satisfied with our cooperation throughout the process and our concrete plans for improved home safety. She said the systemic factors like construction defects and wildlife population issues were the primary contributors, rather than parental neglect. She'd be closing our case with a recommendation for family counseling, but no finding of neglect. The relief I felt hearing those words almost made me dizzy. That first night back home, Tyler refused to sleep in his room. We'd shown him the sealed attic access and explained that no animals could get in anymore, but he stood in his doorway crying and saying he was scared of the ceiling. We tried sitting with him for an hour, but every small sound made him jump. Finally, Natalia and I looked at each other and just nodded. We brought Tyler into our bed where he wedged himself between us and finally relaxed enough to fall asleep. Natalia whispered that we shouldn't push him toward independence right now, when what he needed was security, and I agreed completely. Some milestones could wait until he felt safe again. The school district sent an email that evening announcing they were postponing reopening for 3 more days. They needed to complete a full wildlife exclusion inspection of every building and provide staff training on recognizing rabies symptoms in animals. The next morning, Royce Adair sent a letter to all kindergarten parents explaining the new safety protocols including enhanced outdoor supervision and immediate reporting procedures for any animal sightings. He wrote about his personal commitment to never letting something like the shed incident happen again. Reading between the lines, I could feel how guilty he felt about not reporting the raccoon bite more urgently. I thought about calling him to say it wasn't his fault, but decided he probably needed to work through his own guilt process, just like I was working through mine. Tyler's third vaccine appointment on day 7 went better than the second one. We'd learned to prepare him with honest explanations about why the shots mattered and what would happen step by step. We also promised him a new book and extra screen time afterward. He still cried when the needle went in, but he didn't fight us and recovered faster once it was done. On the walk back to the car, he rolled up his sleeve to show his brother the bandage and said he was being brave to protect himself from getting sick. Jaden told him he was proud of him, and I saw Tyler stand a little taller. Small victories felt huge after the week we'd had. 2 days after Tyler's vaccine appointment, a message appeared in the neighborhood social media group from a family I didn't recognize. They explained their daughter had minimal exposure at one of the birthday parties, just shared a juice box with another kid who might have been near Tyler, but their insurance had a $5,000 deductible, and they'd already maxed out their coverage for the year with previous medical bills. The PEP treatment was going to cost them over $3,000 out of pocket, and they were trying to decide if the risk was low enough to skip it. Reading that post made my stomach hurt, because I knew exactly what kind of impossible choice they were facing, weighing their child's life against financial ruin. Within an hour, Jasmine posted a response saying she was setting up a fundraiser and asked everyone to contribute what they could. She wrote about how this crisis had shown her that our community was stronger than our fear, and that no family should have to choose between safety and bankruptcy. I donated $100 immediately, even though our own finances were tight. Natalia saw the fundraiser on her phone during her lunch break and added another $50. By that evening, the total had reached $800. The next morning, it crossed $2,000. People were sharing the link beyond our neighborhood, adding comments about their own close calls with wildlife or medical emergencies that had drained their savings. 48 hours after Jasmine created the fundraiser, it hit $4,000, and she posted an update saying the family could afford the full treatment now. The mother commented with crying emojis and words about how she'd been losing sleep over the decision, and now her daughter would be safe. Something shifted in our neighborhood after that fundraiser. The fear that had made people avoid us and whisper about negligence transformed into something more useful, a recognition that we were all vulnerable to things beyond our control, and the only real protection was taking care of each other. Royce sent me a text message 3 days later, asking if we could meet for coffee because there was something he needed to talk about. I agreed, and we met at a place near the school during his planning period. He looked tired when he sat down, dark circles under his eyes and his usually neat hair uncombed. He started talking before I even had my coffee, telling me he couldn't sleep because he kept replaying the shed incident in his mind and wondering if he'd reported it more urgently, whether some of the exposures could have been prevented. His voice cracked when he described seeing that raccoon act aggressive and making the choice to just tell the custodian instead of calling animal control immediately. I listened while he talked himself through his guilt spiral, recognizing every thought pattern because I'd been having the same ones about missing the scratching sounds and Tyler's behavior changes. When he finally stopped talking and looked at me waiting for judgment or reassurance, I told him about my therapist, how she'd explained that guilt only serves a purpose if it leads to changed behavior, if it teaches us to do better next time. But when guilt just becomes self-punishment, when we keep replaying the past and torturing ourselves over choices we made with incomplete information, then it's not useful anymore. It's just pain for the sake of pain. Royce's whole body seemed to relax as I talked, his shoulders dropping and his breathing getting deeper. He said nobody had given him permission to forgive himself yet, and he'd been waiting for someone to tell him it was okay to stop feeling terrible. I told him that Tyler was safe, all the kids were safe, and we'd both learned things that would make us better at protecting children in the future. That was the only good thing we could pull from this mess. We finished our coffee talking about the new protocols the school was implementing and how he was planning to incorporate wildlife safety into his curriculum. When we stood up to leave, he hugged me quickly and whispered thank you before heading back to his classroom. 2 weeks into the crisis, Tyler woke up at 3 a.m, confused and disoriented, calling for me but not seeming to recognize where he was when I came into his room. His forehead felt hot under my hand, and when I asked him questions, he gave answers that didn't make sense, talking about the raccoon being in his closet again and needing to feed it. Natalia was already awake and reaching for her phone to call the hospital before I even finished checking his temperature. The thermometer read 101.5, and my hands started shaking as I carried him to the car. Every symptom the doctors had warned us about was flashing through my mind while I drove, the fever and confusion that could mean the virus was already in his brain despite the shots. The ER was nearly empty at that hour, and they took us back immediately when I said rabies exposure and neurological symptoms. They ran blood work and did a full examination while Tyler cried and asked why we kept bringing him to the hospital. A doctor I didn't recognize came in after about an hour and showed us Tyler's ear with an otoscope, pointing out the infection and fluid buildup that was causing the fever and balance issues. Simple ear infection, treatable with antibiotics, nothing to do with rabies. The relief that hit me was so strong I had to sit down. The doctor was gentle when she reminded us that hypervigilance was a normal response to what we'd been through, but we needed to trust that the PP protocol was working and protecting Tyler. She said most parents in our situation ended up in the ER at least once with false alarms, and it didn't mean we were overreacting, just that we were appropriately concerned. She sent us home with amoxicillin and instructions to follow up with our regular pediatrician in a few days. Natalia and I scheduled our first marriage counseling session the following week because the stress had exposed problems in how we handled crises together. I'd been carrying all my guilt and fear alone, not talking to her about the spiral I was in because I thought I needed to be strong for everyone. She'd been managing her anxiety by trying to control everything she could, snapping at me and the kids over small things because the big things felt too overwhelming. Our counselor was a woman in her 50s who worked with families dealing with trauma. She asked us each to describe our typical response patterns when things went wrong. I explained how I tend to internalize everything and shoulder blame alone, thinking that protecting my family means not burdening them with my emotional processing. Natalia talked about how anger and control are her default settings when she's scared, how she knows it's not helpful, but she can't seem to stop herself in the moment. The counselor nodded like she'd heard these patterns 1,000 times before. She taught us some techniques for checking in with each other during stressful situations, for naming our emotions instead of acting them out, for sharing the burden instead of either carrying it alone or fighting over who was more stressed. She said this crisis could either break us or make us stronger, depending on whether we chose to process it as a team or as individuals under the same roof. That language stuck with me, the idea that we had a choice in how this shaped our marriage. We scheduled weekly sessions for the next month and both committed to actually practicing the communication techniques she taught us instead of just nodding and forgetting them as soon as we left her office. The first full night where everyone slept in their own beds without nightmares or middle of the night, panic felt like a small miracle. Tyler still insisted on keeping his closet door open and a nightlight on, and I could hear him get up twice to check that the closet was really empty before settling back under his covers. Jaden had moved his bed away from the wall he shared with the attic, pushing it into the center of his room, where he felt safer from whatever might be above him. Natalia and I lay in our own bed listening to the house settle, both of us tense and waiting for one of the kids to cry out or come running into our room. But the hours passed quietly, and when morning came, we realized we'd all made it through the whole night in our own spaces. It wasn't the same as before the crisis, when everyone slept soundly and doors stayed closed and nobody worried about animals in the walls. But it was our new normal, the changed landscape of our home where we were learning to feel safe again within our adjusted boundaries. I checked on both boys before going downstairs for coffee and found them still sleeping peacefully, Tyler with his arm around his stuffed elephant and Jaden sprawled across his relocated bed. Small progress, but progress nonetheless. Edgar held a final briefing 3 weeks after the initial exposure at the community center. The room was packed with families who'd been affected, all of us waiting to hear the official word on whether the crisis was really over. Edgar stood at the front with his charts and data, looking more relaxed than I'd seen him since this started. He announced that the incident was officially contained with 0 confirmed rabies cases in humans due to the rapid PEP response. Every identified exposure had received treatment. All the animal testing had come back positive, confirming the threat was real, and the community's cooperation had prevented what could have been a public health catastrophe. He showed us statistics about how rabies has a nearly 100% fatality rate once symptoms appear, but how the PEP protocol has a nearly 100% success rate when started promptly. We'd been lucky, he said, not in the exposure itself, but in the timing of discovery and the speed of response. He thanked everyone for their patience during the evacuation, for their honesty during contact tracing, for trusting the medical guidance even when it was scary and expensive. The room erupted in applause when he finished, and several people were crying with relief. I shook his hand afterward and thanked him for coordinating everything, for making sense of the chaos and keeping our community safe. He told me our family's transparency about Tyler's exposures had probably saved lives by helping them identify the full scope of potential contact. That made me feel slightly less guilty about the whole situation, knowing that at least our honesty had helped prevent the worst outcomes. Elena sent us a formal letter a few days later closing our CPS case. I opened it with shaking hands, worried despite her earlier reassurances that the investigation might have found something we'd missed. But the letter was full of commendations for our cooperation and follow-through on all safety recommendations. She wrote that our family had demonstrated appropriate response to an unprecedented situation and that the systemic factors, specifically the construction defects and wildlife population issues, were the primary contributors rather than parental negligence. She noted that we'd immediately sought medical care when we discovered the exposure, that we'd been transparent with authorities about all potential contacts, that we'd completed all required safety improvements to our home, and that we'd engaged with family counseling to process the trauma. The case was closed with no findings of neglect or abuse. I read the letter 3 times to make sure I understood it correctly, then called Natalia at work to tell her. She cried with relief and said she'd been having nightmares about losing the kids over this, about some social worker deciding we were unfit parents because we hadn't noticed a raccoon living in our house. Having it officially over felt like we could finally exhale completely. Our insurance company processed the final claims and sent us a breakdown of coverage versus our responsibility. Between their payment and our out-of-pocket costs, we had a clear path to financial stability within the year. The total bill had been over $15,000 between medical treatment, biohazard remediation, and home repairs, but insurance covered $9,000 after our deductible. We took out a small loan for the remaining $6,000 and set up a payment plan that would have it paid off in 18 months. Natalia picked up some extra shifts at the hospital to accelerate paying down the loan, and I got a small raise at work after my boss felt guilty about his initial response to my emergency leave request. He actually apologized during my review, saying he'd reacted poorly to a legitimate family crisis, and he was adjusting the company's emergency leave policy to be more flexible for employees dealing with medical situations. The raise was modest, but it meant we could cover the loan payments without cutting into our regular budget too severely. We weren't going to be financially comfortable for a while, but we also weren't facing bankruptcy or losing our house, which had been real fears during those first few days. The neighborhood organized a wildlife safety workshop 6 weeks after the initial exposure, led by animal control and the health department. They held it at the community center on a Saturday morning, and over 100 families showed up. Trent brought examples of the kind of damage raccoons and other wildlife can cause, showing photos of attic destruction and explaining how to identify entry points. The health department staff talked about recognizing rabies symptoms in animals and the importance of teaching children never to approach or touch wild animals, no matter how friendly they seem. Tyler participated by standing up when they asked if any kids wanted to share their experiences. He rolled up his sleeves to show his vaccine injection sites, which he called his brave shot scars, and explained to the other children why wild animals need to stay wild, even if they look cute or seem friendly. He told them about his raccoon friend and how sad he was when it got sick, but how he understood now that wild animals can carry diseases that make people very sick too. Watching him transform his trauma into education for others showed me he was processing the experience in healthy ways, finding meaning in helping others avoid what he'd been through. Several parents came up to us afterward and thanked Tyler for being brave enough to share his story. One little girl told him she'd been feeding a stray cat in her backyard, but now she was going to tell her parents instead of keeping it secret. Tyler looked proud of himself in a way I hadn't seen since before the crisis started. 3 months later, we were settling into routines that felt sustainable rather than just survival mode. Tyler had completed his full vaccine series without complications, getting his final shot on day 14, and then having follow-up appointments to confirm his immune response was adequate. Jaden was back to his normal preteen self, with added awareness about home safety, checking locks and sealed entry points without us having to remind him. Natalia and I were communicating better than we had before the crisis, actually using the techniques our counselor taught us, and catching ourselves when we fell into old patterns. Our neighborhood had implemented a new wildlife reporting system where anyone who spotted an animal acting strangely could text a central number that went directly to animal control and the health department. Trent's team did regular inspections of our entire development, checking for new entry points and signs of wildlife activity. I still felt a spike of anxiety when I heard scratching sounds anywhere in the house, immediately investigating instead of dismissing it as normal settling. But I also knew we were prepared now in ways we weren't before, educated about risks we'd been ignorant of, and equipped with knowledge about how to respond. Our family had come through this stronger and more connected than I could have hoped, having faced something terrifying together and survived it. We weren't the same people we'd been before Tyler befriended that raccoon, but maybe that wasn't entirely a bad thing. What a story, right? Even in the scariest situations, there's always room for hope and learning. Thank you for being here and listening all the way through. Subscribe if you haven't already, because I love sharing these powerful stories with you. Wishing you a peaceful rest of your day, and I'll catch you soon.